Our scripture reading this morning comes from Genesis 45, verses 1 to 15. You can follow along in the Bibles in the pew if you'd like. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers couldn't answer him. So dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. As I recall, back in my day, Joseph and his coat of many colors was a favorite lesson in Sunday school, right? I think it was because we could color the coat nice and pretty. But so I wouldn't be surprised if everyone here in the sanctuary remembers this story. The story goes that Jacob and his 12 sons live in the land of Canaan. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, and Jacob gives him a coat of many colors. Joseph's brothers are jealous of Joseph, and they plot to kill him. However, they think better of that idea. Instead, they sell him into slavery to the Ishmaelites. Then they take his coat, tear it up, and douse it with goat's blood to convince their father that Joseph has died. Joseph, meanwhile, is taken to Egypt and is bought by Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Potiphar's wife is smitten by Joseph and propositions him. Well, that part I don't remember from Sunday school.
Knock that out.
Joseph, however, declines her proposition, and she has him thrown in prison. Joseph just can't seem to get a break here. However, he gets himself out of prison by interpreting the Pharaoh's dreams, and the Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of the land of Egypt. Joseph wisely stores up huge amounts of food and grain during Egypt's 7 years of abundance. Meanwhile, Jacob and his family are suffering from the famine in Canaan, and he sends Joseph's brothers to Egypt for grain. And you know the rest of the story from today's Bible reading. Joseph's story is a story of reconciliation. Joseph sees his brothers having changed, and he immediately forgives them. Now just pay attention for a moment to the language of our passage. In verse 2, it says, and he wept. Does that not sound like our very famous verse from John 11:35? Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible. In verse 3, then, it says the brothers are terrified, for they fear Joseph's revenge. When his brothers realized Joseph has forgiven them, his brother Benjamin wept. I'm guessing he was tremendously relieved. And Joseph kisses all his brothers and weeps over them. And later they talk. This passage is so descriptive of the intense emotions taking place, from anger and fear to forgiveness and love. Then Joseph invites Jacob, all his brothers and their families to come to Egypt and share in their abundant stores of food. He not only forgives them, but he generously shares with them and cares for them. Knowing some of the violent stories in the Old Testament, you know Joseph could just as well have had his men kill all those brothers. After all, he sold them into slavery. Joseph does the opposite. What a wonderful story of forgiveness and reconciliation within family. Let's just fast forward a few centuries and look at some modern stories of reconciliation. I call this Amy and Joe's story. In 1992, Joe Avila was driving drunk when he rear-ended a car driven by 17-year-old Amy Wall as she was returning home from a Clint Black concert. She did not survive the crash. Joe pleaded guilty to the charges and received a 12-year sentence for second-degree homicide. While in prison, Joe turned his life around. He cared for the prison's hospice patients and served in the prison chapel, sharing the gospel with fellow prisoners. He was also able to maintain a connection with his daughters through a program called Prison Fellowship Angel Tree. On January 6th, Joe Avila went home, where he was welcomed with open arms by his family and by his church. Shortly after his release, Amy's brother Derek asked to meet Joe. Derek shared stories of his childhood with his sister. He told Joe how much he loved his sister, and he thought of Joe as a monster that deserved the electric chair. But then he and his family watched Joe's progress as he served his prison term, and they began to forgive Joe. A little later, Amy's father met with Joe and told him how much he admired the work that Joe had done in prison. And finally, Amy's mother asked to meet Joe. She shared stories of Amy that illustrated for Joe just how precious Amy's life had been. Joe recognized that the ending of Amy's life had been the beginning of his new sober life. And he thanked God for Amy and her family. Amy's family relationship with Joe became stronger. Amy's parents and brother forgave Joe, and later he and Amy's family participated in a restorative justice council in front of hundreds of people. Another amazing story of reconciliation. This is the Brandy Carlisle story. Brandy Carlisle was 15 years old when she made the important decision to be baptized. She completed the preparations and carried out the proper studies. The big day came and she gathered at the church with her family and her friends. But when she approached the altar to be baptized, the minister told her he could not baptize her because she was gay and would not affirm a willingness to change her gayness. Brandy Carlisle was devastated, horribly devastated. She admits it wasn't easy and it took a lot of work, but she was able to forgive the minister. And as a result of her experience, she wrote an entire album entitled, "By the Way, I Forgive You." She dedicated the album to those who are marginalized by society, and some of the songs express the emotional labor it took to confront her pain, to resist alienation, and to forgive her minister. She reconciled with her God, and she remains a Christian. The story of Edna. Edna Moore was born in 1928, just 1 year before the Great Depression. Her mother was often gone from home, making trips from Ohio to Michigan, and she finally left Edna on her own at the age of 15. At first, Edna lived with her stepfather, then a friend, then she moved into a boarding house. She worked at various menial jobs through school. Her teachers often let her sleep in class because they knew she hadn't gotten enough rest. Now, Edna could have estranged herself from her mother for the rest of her life. Instead, she, because she had a deep faith in Jesus, reconciled with her mother and took care of her when she reached old age. She kept active in her church, married, and she and her husband of 67 years raised their daughters to be loving and forgiving. Another story of reconciliation. The Amish community story. On October 2nd, 2006, 32-year-old Charlie Roberts barricaded himself in a one-room Amish schoolhouse in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and opened fire, killing 5 children and injuring 5 more before he killed himself. The news headlines about the tragedy, however, were superseded by what happened after the shooting. Charlie's parents, Charlie Sr. and Terry Roberts, were devastated by their son's action. They held a private funeral service for their son, agonizing that they would never be able to face those Amish friends again. But as they approached the graveside, a group of Amish people, numbering around 40, came out from the side of the cemetery and formed a crescent around Charlie Sr. and Terry, supporting them in their grief. Charlie's parents and the Amish community continue to have a close relationship to this day. Rosanna, the most injured of the Amish survivors, is still tube-fed and in a wheelchair. Terry Roberts, the shooter's mother, helps with Rosanna once a week. She reads to her, she bathes her, and she dries her hair. One of the Amish fathers said, quote, "None of us would have ever chosen this, but the relationships that we built through it, you can't put a price on it. Love instead of hatred, community instead of alienation." Like they say on the credit card ad, priceless. All these stories are stories of reconciliation. To reconcile means to restore to friendship or harmony. The process requires two parties, the person or persons who recognize the wrong they've committed, and the person or persons who acknowledge the gesture and forgive the wrongdoers. All parties must be active in reconciliation. But just how do we forgive? I mean, there's a lot of Bible verses about forgiveness, right? Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ forgave you. Matthew 7:11, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Ephesians 4:31, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. And finally, Matthew 18:21, then Peter said to Jesus, he turned to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. Well, these verses are nice directives on how to live. They're kind of simple, straightforward statements. They almost make it sound like forgiveness comes easily. Just say it, and it's going to happen. But let's face it, forgiveness and reconciliation are not easy. I realize that the stories we just heard are stories of extreme forgiveness. There's probably not a person here that has ever been sold into slavery, right? Or even knows anyone who's been sold into slavery. Although, unfortunately, we know it still exists. When I went to get my airplane ticket, there was a warning about watching for people that might be taken away as slaves. Can you, for just a minute, put yourself in Joseph's sandals or the shoes of Amy's family, Brandy Carlisle, Edna, or the Amish community? I do see one thing that they had in common, and that is their deep faith in Jesus. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not gifts wrapped in nice packages with pretty paper and bows and all that stuff. No, they're radical concepts. They often involve introspection, pain, regret, guilt, anger, grief, and a whole lot of emotional work. Sometimes the most difficult step is forgiving oneself, regardless of which side of the story one is on. The Bible doesn't give us an easy 1, 2, 3 step-by-step guide to forgiveness. And we know there isn't one. It does, however, give us a perfect example of forgiveness. And we look at it here every single Sunday. The cross. The one we're looking at here is kind of nice and smooth and finished and pretty wood. The real cross didn't look like that. The real cross was a different story. For a moment, just think about the story of the cross. Jesus did the radical, gritty, painful, dirty work that secured our forgiveness. We can look to Jesus and to his life and to his death on the cross for our way to forgiveness. And we can look to these stories of radical forgiveness that we just talked about to see that it is possible. For many of us, in extreme cases, it may take the cross and much prayer and the wisdom and example of others and a whole lot of time and emotional work to find our way to forgiveness. I'm thinking forgiveness and reconciliation are much like the process of grief. Some may experience it immediately, and others may find it weeks, months, or maybe even years later. Jesus, Joseph, and the other stories we just heard are examples of radical forgiveness, of hard-fought reconciliation, of community over alienation, and the triumph of love over hatred. God calls on us to mend those fences, to forgive, to reconcile, and to find empathy, gratitude, peace, and purpose. And above all, to love. I'm going to close with my favorite Bible verse, and I ripped it off of my mirror in the bathroom this morning, so I've read it many times. It's Colossians 3, verses 12 to 14. So, chosen by God for this new life of love, dress in the wardrobe God picked for you. Compassion, kindness, humility, quiet strength, discipline. Be even-tempered, content with second place, quick to forgive an offense. Forgive as quickly and completely as the Master forgave you. And regardless of what else you put on, wear love. It's the basic, all-purpose garment. Never be without it. Amen.